Well, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all. We have a slightly smaller group today. I'm guessing that has to do with all the beautiful weather we're having. So, not really Florida weather. Quite warm, but it is rainy season. Rainy season late though. My memory of it, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but my memory of it was this is always like the summer, and it was always like the afternoons, right? You know.
Keep us from getting the fires that
There you go. There you go. That's one way of thinking about it. Well, it's great to see you all. We're here for another class in our series that we're calling Turning Points. We're looking at key moments in the history of the Christian church where very, very significant things happened. Where something changed in a significant way. And today we're talking about the Crusades. It's a really interesting topic for many of us, in part because we live in a world that has been shaped by the so-called War on Terror. I remember where I was and what I was doing when I heard that the first of the trade towers had been hit by a plane. Initially, everyone thought that it was a mistake, maybe that the plane had gone off course. Then there was a second tower that was struck, and everyone realized that this was actually a terror attack. My life, I'm 34 years old, my life has been very much shaped by the so-called War on Terror, which has a lot to do with the way that Christians, we as Christians, relate to the religion of Islam. Interestingly, my wife teaches high school, and this last year they graduated a high school class that is the first class to have been born after 9/11. So we have a whole generation going off to college that were born after 9/11 happened, which is just really interesting. It's kind of inconceivable to me because my life has been very much shaped by that. I had a number of friends who went off and fought in the Second Iraq War or served in Afghanistan. And it's interesting to me to think of a whole generation that was born after that critical moment in September of 2001. So we want to think today about some resources that we can use to think through the history of the Crusades and also to think through the issue of war more generally. As we'll talk a little bit about today, you know, the Crusades were a war that was waged over many centuries between Christians and Muslims, but also between different types of Christians. And they were wars that were waged by Christians against people that they perceived to be heretics. One of the misconceptions about the Crusades is that all of them were fought in the Middle East, and that's not true. Many of the Crusades were actually waged and fought in Europe itself. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. But to start our class off today, before I open us in prayer, I thought that I would tell you about some of the scenes that I think of when I think of war more generally and of people going off to war. This is a very, very famous motif in literature and in history of a father going off to war and bidding goodbye to his wife. You know, a father going off to war and bidding goodbye to his children. So one of the earliest scenes that we have comes from a book called the Iliad. Many of you have read the Iliad or heard of the Iliad by Homer. It's one of the first books about war. It's about the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And in particular, there's one hero in the story named Hector. Hector is the leader of the Trojan armies. He's called Hector of the Shining Helmet because he wears a very, very big, prominent helmet. He's called Horse-Breaking Hector in the Iliad. And he's good and noble. Homer, as he depicts Hector to us, depicts him as a very noble hero. And one of the things that Hector has to do at a critical point in this work called the Iliad is bid goodbye to his wife Andromache and their little son Astyanax. And if you know the scene, it's a really moving scene because Hector is going to go fight a demigod named Achilles. Okay? And your chances of beating a demigod like Achilles are not very good. So Hector knows that this probably won't turn out well. You as the reader know that Hector's going to end up being killed by Achilles. His body will be desecrated and he'll be dragged around the city. But before that happens, he goes and says goodbye to his wife Andromache and to his son Astyanax. And it's a really, really moving scene because he tells Andromache that if he were not to fight, that he would be a coward. That he is going to fight for her to keep her from being enslaved and mistreated. And then he speaks to his son, and he bends down and attempts to pick up his little boy Astyanax. And it's a very moving moment in the Iliad because Astyanax pulls away. Because as a little boy, he's terrified by this helmet that his father is wearing. And so the father takes the helmet off, picks up his little boy, and talks to him. And what he says is something that I think every father, and more generally every parent, can sympathize with and relate to. He says to his son all the things that he loves about him, but he says to him that he hopes that one day someone will see Astyanax and say, there goes Hector's son. He's so much like his father, but better. And that's what you want as a parent, right? But it's a very moving scene of a father going off to war, going off to fight, and in Hector's case, die for his city. You see these scenes all through literature. I have here a copy of War and Peace, which I'm going to now read for you all. Just kidding. But War and Peace has one of my favorite parting scenes. Maybe some of you will know it. It's the scene where Count Bolkonsky bids goodbye to his son, Prince Andrei. Prince Andrei is one of the main characters of War and Peace. And in this very moving scene, Count Bolkonsky says to his son as he's going off to fight in the Russian army against Napoleon and the French, he says two things to him. He says, if you are killed, I will be sad, but if you behave dishonorably, I will be ashamed. And the son has this amazing response because he says to him, you only had to tell me the first thing. You didn't have to tell me the second. So our literature is often very much taken up with this theme of people going off to fight in a war. And you can think of many other scenes, many other moving scenes, such as the ones I've related to you. But there's a dark side to war. It isn't just parades. It isn't fun and games. And literature gives us resources to think about that too. We're coming up on November 11th, where we celebrate and commemorate the end of World War I. Many of you will know that when World War I began, most people in Europe were very excited. There were parades and parties. The media was very excited. All the leaders were saying things like, Europe needs a little bit of a bloodletting. Okay? We've got all these pent-up tensions. We need some bloodletting. Okay? But it didn't turn out that way. As you know, millions died in the mud in France, in trenches. And you can think of some of the poems that come from that period from the so-called war poets. Isaac Rosenberg, who wrote a poem called Daybreak in the Trenches, where he tells you about the morning he woke up in the trench and a little rat scrambled across the ground that was separating his trench from the Germans' trenches. And the little rat comes over and stands on his hand and looks at him. And he says to this rat, droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. You're not allowed to do this. There's another poem called Dulca et decorum est, which is one of my favorite poems, by another of these war poets named Wilfred Owen. And the title is a shortened form of a Latin phrase, Dulca et decorum est pro patria mori. It's attributed to an old Roman author named Horace. Sweet and fitting it is to die for country. Wilfred Owen writes this poem in a state of disillusionment. See, he bought the lies that this was going to be a great campaign. We were going to teach the Germans a lesson and so on. And then found himself in the trenches in the mud. He wrote this in a great state of disillusionment after a gas attack. You know that World War I was the first major war where gas was used on a very large scale. Very important and famous German scientist, actually. We have buildings and centers named for him, even in Florida, was the one who developed mustard gas, which the Germans used. Wilfred Owen was there in the trenches the first time the Germans used this gas against the Allies. And what he remembers is this scene of the gas coming across the trenches and many of his friends scrambling to put their gas masks on. He manages to get his mask on, but one of his closest friends doesn't. Of course, dies a brutal death by gas. And Wilfred Owen writes this poem remembering walking behind the wagon that was carrying the body of his friend, and he talks about his friend's head, which hung out from the wagon, and the distorted features of the face. And he says, if you could walk alongside me and see this face with me, you wouldn't tell little children eager for glory, Dulca et decorum est pro patria mori. Okay? So war can be glorious, and many of us think of it as very glorious, Many of us, myself included, who are parents would be honored to have their sons serve in a just war. I would be very honored for that to happen. Yet at the same time, we want to be careful that we don't glorify it too much. There's a famous general who said, it's a good thing that war is so terrible, or else we would love it too much. War has a very, very dark underside to it. And we're going to talk about that in our class here today. So let me open us in prayer, and then we'll begin. Our Father, we come to you this morning on this dark and dreary and rainy morning. We thank you for bringing us all here safely. We thank you for your providence in our lives that has brought us here to this class, here to this church, for the many ways in which we are encouraged as we see each other, as we interact with each other, as we talk to each other about all the different things going on in our lives. I ask that this class would be an encouragement to us as we look at one very important but very controversial aspect in the history of the church. I ask that we would both know more after this class, but also love you more after this class as well. So I ask you all these things for Jesus' sake. Amen. Well, I thought I would begin the class today with a reading that comes from Matthew's Gospel. And you're welcome to turn with me to Matthew chapter 5. If you have your Bibles with you, if you don't, it's perfectly fine just to listen along. And this passage in Matthew 5 that we're going to look at is part of the famous so-called Sermon on the Mount that Jesus preached. And beginning in verse 38 of Matthew chapter 5, we read these words of Jesus. He says, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your coat as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, lost my page here. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." These words from Matthew 5, and in particular, the words responding to the "you have heard, an eye for an eye," and so on, are very controversial words in the Christian tradition. Many Christians, since Jesus' day, have interpreted them to command pacifism. Okay? There are many Christians, including some that I very deeply respect and admire, who believe that the words of Jesus prohibit carrying out a war in any conditions and under any circumstances. Many of you will have heard, for instance, of Scott McKnight. He's a wonderful professor, very, very much someone that I look up to and appreciate as a scholar. Scott McKnight would be a Christian thinker who would tend to be what we would call pacifist. Okay? He believes that the Sermon on the Mount needs to be taken very seriously, and therefore it is wrong for Christians to exercise the sword, going to war, or being violent in ways against even evildoers. Now, I want to tell you at the outset that that is not my position, and it has not been the position of the majority of Christians for many, many centuries. The majority of Christians for many, many centuries have interpreted this passage in Matthew as applying to Christians on an individual level. Okay? So that if you were to walk up here, please don't do this, but if you were to walk up here and smack me in the face, okay, I would be required to turn the other cheek. Okay? But that is because you have done that to me as an individual, and the command of Jesus applies to me as an individual. Most Christians, following people like St. Augustine and Martin Luther, have said that when you are in a role, such as a judge or a soldier or a police officer, you have an obligation to carry out force and even to carry out violence, okay? If you are doing so in what we would call a just cause. And we'll look at that and talk about that, what actually makes a cause just. But this class today is going to come from the perspective of that sort of approach. So I have a great deal of respect and admiration for people who are pacifistic, for Christians who take the words of Jesus to apply to all of us, whatever our role. But that's not the perspective that I have, and that's not the perspective the class is going to be taught from. Does that make sense? Many of you know this. Many Christians and others who are pacifists have still served in the military, but they often serve in non-combat roles, right? So they will serve as ambulance drivers, stretcher bearers, and so on. Okay, that's not the perspective that I'm taking this morning. Instead, we're going to look at what makes a war just, and in particular, we're going to look at the Crusades. So before we do that, let's look at the Crusades themselves and talk a little bit about what were the Crusades. The Crusades began about 1,000 years ago in 1095. They began in a town in France called Clermont. And they began at the bidding of the Pope. The Pope at the time was named Urban II. And the Pope, at a council that was held in France, called on the soldiers of Christendom to march to the east and reclaim the Holy Land for Christians. Now, who were they going to reclaim it from? Well, a religion that had been growing for about 4 centuries, a religion that was founded by a man named Muhammad, who claimed to have certain visions in a cave, and who authored a work called the Quran, the sacred scriptures of those who follow Muhammad, called Muslims. Okay? So this religion had been spreading for about 4 centuries, and by the time that Urban calls for this crusade, much of what used to be Christendom was now controlled by Islam. Okay? He calls for Christian soldiers to march to the east and to reclaim that territory. Now, he didn't do that without any urging. The emperor of the Eastern Empire, the so-called Byzantine emperor, had written to Urban begging him to send soldiers to help him fight Muslim armies. Okay? The emperor of the East, the Byzantine emperor, was a very clever man, and he realized he didn't have the manpower to retake some of the territories, most especially Jerusalem and other areas of the Holy Land from the Muslims, so he thought he would get Western armies to come over and help him out. Now, in one of the true ironies of history, one of the results of the Crusades was that about 100 years after this, crusading armies from the West ended up sacking the city of Constantinople, okay, a Christian capital. So one of the ironies of this was that the empire that had asked for the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire, ended up losing its own capital city, Constantinople, to a crusading army. Okay, so one of the things that you know about war is that things don't always turn out the way you expected, right? When you call for a war, it can end up not turning out the way you hoped it would, and that's certainly true in this story. In any event, Urban's call was heeded by many of the soldiers in Christendom, thousands of whom took up the cross and started to march east to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity and the West. There are all sorts of stories about this. Some of them say that the soldiers cut their garments into the shape of a cross and put the cross onto their uniforms or onto their shields. Other stories say that Urban and others were using the phrase Deus vult in Latin, God wills it. Okay? If you've ever seen a movie that showed the Crusaders, you know, they're probably chanting that as they go along. Okay? The Crusades were initially wildly successful, beyond anyone's dreams. The Crusaders got to the Holy Land and actually retook the city of Jerusalem. Within a few years of Pope Urban's call for the Crusades, they had retaken Jerusalem and much of the Holy Land. They then put soldiers in those areas and turned that into a Christian kingdom. There were tremendous atrocities committed by the Crusaders along the way. Some of our stories are really fascinating in that many crusading armies didn't get to the Holy Land because Christian citizens of Europe had slaughtered them. So they were raiding and pillaging so much in Europe that many European members of towns and cities actually rose up and killed the Crusaders before they could even get to the Holy Land. But they did manage to take the city of Jerusalem and hold the city of Jerusalem for about a century as a Christian province. The stories of the fall of Jerusalem are particularly sad. The reports that come to us from Crusaders tell us that after they had taken the city, they embarked in about a 3-day process of murder. They killed Christians, Jews, and Muslims inside of the city of Jerusalem. They did not discriminate between them. One of the crusading soldiers who wrote back home describes being on his way to one of the main churches to give thanks to God and wading through the bodies of men, women, and children that had been slaughtered. Okay? This is what war looks like. In any event, the Crusades then went on for about 7 centuries. One of the misconceptions that we have about the Crusades is that they happened a long time ago. There were crusading armies in Europe into the 1700s and early 1800s. Crusade after crusade after crusade was launched. Another misconception we have, as I mentioned, is that all of them were fought in the Holy Land. Many of them weren't. Many of them were launched against Christian groups and what were believed to be heretical groups in Europe. So a group called the Cathars in the south of France had crusades launched against them. And the crusaders who were capturing and killing these so-called heretics had phrases like, "We send them to God and He'll figure it out." Okay? So we'll kill them, send them to God, and then He can determine whether or not they were really heretics. Okay? Quite brutal. Now we have to remember this is a very brutal time. Okay? In this period, according to the code of warfare, it was expected that when you came to a city, when your army came to a city, you would give them an opportunity to surrender. If they failed to surrender, it was standard practice to sack that city and kill or enslave everyone inside. It was typically a 3-day grace period that was granted to the army to do whatever they liked to that city. And usually after 3 days, that would be lifted and they would be required to respect property and so on. Okay? This is a very brutal time. There were atrocities that were committed on both sides. It would not be fair to act as if Christians were the only ones who were committing atrocities. Many of the Muslim leaders of Muslim armies were committing tremendous atrocities as well. Historians to this day debate a great deal the extent to which these crusades were launched on behalf of Christians living in Islamic territories. Many of you will know this, but most Muslim leaders for the first 400 years of Islam followed Muhammad in considering Christians to be people of the book. Okay? Muslims called Christians people of the book. Any idea who else they called that? One other religious group. Jews. Okay? So Jews and Christians and Muslims, according to Muhammad, were people of the book. Now Muhammad did not believe that Christians were brothers, but he believed they were closer to the truth than pagans, especially in Saudi Arabia. So because of that, if you were Jewish or if you were a Christian, you could live under a Muslim leader and often just pay an extra tax, a religious tax based on your religious affiliation. For most of the time that Islam controlled these areas, the majority of their population were Christian, not Muslim. Okay? Many of the stories that made their way to Pope Urban and others involved atrocities being committed against Christians. And scholars to this day debate the veracity of those, to what extent those things were actually happening, and to what extent those things were what we might today call propaganda. Okay? And we'll see some of the reasons for that when we talk about what makes a war just or not. In any event, there are basically 3 reasons that we can look at as far as why Pope Urban and many others called for crusades. Okay? If you're taking notes, you might want to write these down because these help give you a perspective on why the crusades were launched and fought. One of the main reasons was the most obvious one, which was literally just to retake the Holy Land. Okay? Crusaders wanted to reconquer territory that had been held by Christians for many, many years, but had been conquered by Islam. It's a very obvious reason. There are a couple other reasons, though, that aren't as obvious. One reason that the Crusades were launched was actually in an effort to unify Christians. And Christians in Europe were fighting each other tooth and nail over everything. Okay? And so one of the reasons the Crusades were launched was to direct the attentions of Christian soldiers away from killing each other and towards killing a common enemy. Okay? Urban II and others were looking at a Europe that was wrecked, completely wrecked by warfare. You've heard of the Normans. Okay? William the Conqueror and others who came to England and conquered England in 1066. The Normans were rampaging around Christian Europe as Christians, killing other Christians. One of the reasons for this is because of the rule of primogeniture, the idea that the firstborn son inherits the father's property. Famously, when you have two sons, you have the heir and the spare, right? I'll tell my younger brother that, right? Okay, you got an heir and a spare. The spare has a couple options open to him. One, go into the church. Two, go into the army. And what do you do in the army? Well, you conquer territory for yourself. Okay? So all of these Normans are running around Europe conquering territory. Most of them are second-born or illegitimate sons who are trying to conquer territory within Europe for themselves. And one of the things that Pope Urban does, and it's a very, very clever tactic, most scholars are in agreement that this is one of the things that he's doing, is saying, no, go conquer over there. Take those energies that you're using against your fellow Christians and direct them against an exterior enemy. Urban was very savvy to something that Livy, the Roman historian, had said many years before, which is that the Romans were unified in their city so long as they had an enemy outside. And isn't that true? I mean, that's true for most of us, right? You become a lot friendlier with people if you're fighting a common enemy. Okay? So Urban recognized that. Another reason that Urban launched these crusades was in an effort to elevate himself and give himself more power. We talked last week about the Great Schism of 1054, and one of the things that we talked about is the growth of the power and authority of the Pope in Europe. Urban has an army now. Think about that. He is raising an army, and he's the one calling for the crusade. It gives him tremendous power in Europe, not just as a leader of the church, but as a leader of an army, essentially. Okay? Now, how does he do that? Well, he had to get creative, and theologians had to get very creative. Maybe you'll remember the scene in the garden when what Roman Catholics would believe the predecessor to the Pope, Peter, pulls out his sword and strikes off a man's ear. You remember this? He gets very eager. And Jesus says, "Put it away, Peter." Right? Well, for about 1,000 years, people have interpreted that and said, that's the command to the Pope. Okay? He does not have the right to wield the temporal sword. But then some theologians right before Urban started saying, maybe what Jesus meant, if you look at it carefully, is put it away, Peter, for now. Okay? Don't use it right now. Wait 1,000 years and then whip it out again when you really need it against Muslims. Okay? Now, that's a reminder to us of how creative we can get interpreting Scripture when it goes against what we want to do, right? Put it away, Peter, for now. Here I think of George Orwell, with all the different rules. You remember in Animal Farm. No animal shall kill another animal, and then they modify it to without cause, right? All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, right? Okay, we can do that when we interpret Scripture, and certainly that was being done here. Pope, who had a very spiritual position for the first 1,000 years, now is taking on a very temporal position. He is wielding a sword. He has an army behind him now. And that is going to cause untold problems for the next 500 years or so. This is going to be one of the things that the reformers are very, very unhappy with, that the Pope has this kind of temporal power. He's wielding a sword. In any event, that's an overview of the Crusades, why they happened, and some details about them. If you're interested in other resources on the Crusades, I want to recommend two scholars to you. One of them is named Jonathan Riley Smith. He's a British scholar, and he has spent his life writing on the Crusades. He has a number of multi-volume series on the Crusades. Jonathan Riley Smith is a really, really careful scholar, and he rebuts a lot of the misconceptions about the Crusades. Okay? Many people, especially in the last 20 years or so, have tried to say that the Crusades were essentially only the Christians' fault. That Christians were the only ones to commit atrocities. And Jonathan Riley Smith is very clear that that's not true. And that even some of the atrocities placed on the shoulders of Christians were not actually committed by them. So if you're interested in a very careful, very scholarly treatment, Jonathan Riley Smith is a very good place to go. Another scholar, also a British scholar, is named Stephen Runciman. Stephen Runciman likewise spent much of his life actually writing about the details of the Crusades. So those are two recommendations I would make to you. In terms of transitioning, though, at this point, I would like to talk not about the Crusades per se, but about a broader topic, which is when is it right to go to war and how should war be conducted? And we can look at this through the lens of the Crusades and apply this to the Crusades and ask ourselves, were the Crusades actually a just war? So this analysis is known as just war theory. I'm sure most of you have heard of just war theory. Okay? Christians, since Christ's time, who believe, as I do, that the commands of the Sermon on the Mount are not made to us as public officials, but rather as private individuals, have to come up with a theory for when you can and can't go to war. We all know that certain wars are not just, and others were, okay? Or at least most of us would agree to that. The majority of Christians have. We know that World War II, as it was fought by the Allied powers, would probably be rightly considered a just war, okay? As Americans waged that against Germany. But we know that the war that was waged by Hitler against Poland was not a just war, right? So what do we look at to determine whether we should go to war and how we should engage in war? Especially as Christians, we look at something called just war theory. The two most important thinkers for just war theory are St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas. We've talked about both of these men in the past in our classes together. But basically, what both of them do is put together a theory for determining whether a war is just. Okay? And there are two parts to the analysis. If you're taking notes, write these down because it's helpful as you think through this. There is what's called right to war. That's the first part. In Latin, it's jus ad bellum, right to war. And right in war. In Latin, jus in bellum. Okay? Right to war and right in war. What do I mean by that? Well, do you have the right to go to war in the first place? That's one part of the analysis. But the second part of the analysis is, even if you have the right to go to war, are you, when you go about waging the war, waging it in the right way? We all know this intuitively, right? Let's say there's an attack on an American ship, a little PT boat from, Iran or one of those countries comes up to a ship and fires a missile at a US ship. You all know that no sane president, Donald Trump or Barack Obama or any president that we've had, would fire a nuclear weapon at Iran, okay? We may have the right to go to war, but that doesn't seem like the right response. Typically there's a surgical strike, there are sanctions, right? Well, this is following a clear just war theory. There is a right to go to war, and then there's a question of when you wage the war itself, are you waging it rightly, okay? So under the question of, do you have the right to go to war, there are two things following Augustine and Aquinas that most Christian scholars have said you must look at, okay? Anybody have a guess as to what would give you a right to go to war?
In defense of your
Yeah.
country?
Yep, and broadly self-defense, okay? The war must be fought defensively. A subcategory under that would be, perhaps you're not defending yourself, but you are defending those who are innocent. Okay? Think of 1938 as Hitler started spreading throughout Europe, right? He took over Czechoslovakia with the assistance of the British. The British leader, Neville Chamberlain, refused to go to war and gave Hitler an innocent country with the assumption that Hitler would just stop at that point. Okay? You've seen these, the footage of Neville Chamberlain with his umbrella. It's good for today with all of our rain, with his umbrella, giving the press conference, we have obtained peace in our time. Hitler is a gentleman. He'll keep his word, right? That hasn't aged well, right? So Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, decided not to go to war and to allow an innocent country to be invaded by Hitler. Most Christian scholars would say there was a right to go to war at that point, and Chamberlain should have gone to war, even though he wasn't per se protecting the British, he would have been protecting a small, innocent country. Does that make sense? So the defensive nature of the war is the key thing that you have to look at when you go to war. Now this is hard, okay? Because just about every war that's ever been waged has been waged with a claim of self-defense. You probably know this, but when Hitler invaded Poland, he invaded Poland in 1939, September 1st of 1939, to defend Germany against Poland. Right? He had taken convicts and dressed them up in Polish military outfits, put them into a German telegraph station and then gunned them down and claimed that the Poles were invading Germany. And then he responded by the entire, Wehrmacht, the Nazi war machine destroying Poland, okay? But even crazy dictators claim self-defense, okay? So it's worth thinking about that. That's a tough element. Is it really in self-defense? You all know very well, when we went to war with Iraq for the second time, there was a claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Is that self-defense if you go to war in that kind of case? That's the question that gets asked. Another aspect of this right to go to war concerns something that isn't as immediately apparent, but I think is really important. It's, do you have a reasonable plan? Do you have a reasonable expectation of winning? Okay? You cannot go to war just to wage war. You have to go to war so that you can have an outcome where you win. This seems obvious, but Africa right now, many countries in Africa are torn apart by little warlords with their little bands and little armies who are terrorizing the countries that they live in, right? And they have no plan to win. There is no reasonable prospect of victory. They're actually waging war to wage war. And so one of the things that just war theorists have always said is that you must not only wage war in order to defend yourself or the innocent, but you must wage war with a reasonable plan of success. Here is what success would look like. And think about that. Think about some of the wars that our country have engaged in the past that have become quagmires. Very famously, scholars have said this about Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War. That the Vietnam War did not have a very clear plan for success. I'm not making comments on whether Vietnam was a just war or not, but one of the things that scholars who've looked back on that war and said was a problem with it is it wasn't always clear to the men on the ground what success would look like. Is that fair? So under just war theory, you look not just at, are you going to war to defend yourself or others, but are you going to war with a reasonable prospect of victory? Now, hopefully that's clear to everyone. You've got that jotted down. The second part of just war theory is jus in belli, right in war. How are you carrying out the war? There are two really important parts of this. The first is discrimination, sometimes called distinction. I don't mean discrimination as in, keeping somebody from dining in your restaurant because they're a different color. I mean discrimination in that there is a difference between military and civilian targets. Right? Under just war theory, you must be making reasonable distinctions. You must be discriminating between military and non-military targets. If you are attacking a military target under just war theory and you're engaged in a just war, you are doing something which is right and just. But if you take a city and murder the women and children inside, that is not just. And you know that can be very effective. A number of armies have done that. Think of the Japanese when they started to invade Japan, when they started to invade China. The so-called Rape of Nanking, where the Japanese army spent months raping and murdering and torturing the civilian members of the city of Nanking. Why? To strike fear in the rest of the country. If you put up a fight, this is what we'll do to you. Okay? A number of those Japanese leaders were hanged at the end of the war for war crimes. They said, well, it's war. And the Allies said, it is war. And if you had been shooting military targets, you would not be on trial. It is that you engaged in combat against children that has you being put on trial. Okay? So this is pretty intuitive to us, I think, that we should attempt to distinguish between military and non-military targets. One really, really tricky thing for just war theory has happened only in the last 100 years. I know that sounds like a long time, but for me that's recent, right? I live in the ancient world. It's one invention in the last 100 years that has really, really challenged this. Do you know what it is? What's that? Yeah, and even further removed from that, but like one step back from that, the airplane, okay? The answer was the atomic bomb. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, delivered by plane, exactly. It's the Enola Gay, is that right? Isn't that the name of the plane that dropped that bomb? The invention of the airplane complicates this. Okay? We now have drones, right, that are often unmanned, controlled by someone back in an office somewhere. The airplane really complicates this because you can now drop things out of the sky onto military and non-military targets. Okay? Just war theorists have spent a lot of time thinking through this. You know that if you bomb a city, you're going to kill a lot of civilians. The Allies did this in Germany in World War II. Anybody read Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut? Okay. It tells the story of what the Allies did to the city of Dresden. They bombed the city and lit it on fire. They literally incinerated the city. Okay. The atomic bomb was dropped, both bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to bring an end to the war between America and Japan. I mean, thousands and thousands of people killed by bombs, many of them civilians. So the question becomes, is that just? Is that a just war? Well, the Allied commanders had estimates of millions who would die in the event of an invasion. They asked Harry Truman about it years later. What did you think about making that decision? The American president making that decision to drop those bombs. They said, "I've never lost a moment's sleep over it." Okay? But just war gives you categories for thinking through that. One of the things that we know very clearly from just war theory is that you are to make every effort to distinguish between military and civilian targets. Where it gets messy is, what if you have a Saddam Hussein who puts his military targets inside schools? Right? I mean, that's where this gets really, really messy, right? We're going to put all of our army, basements under the hospitals. That's really, really tricky. So you got to think through this. As technology improves, we have more and more of an ability to strategically target military rather than non-military sites. You know this. I mean, we've gotten much more efficient and effective at that, at least in this country. So that is one aspect of the right in war, that you must discriminate, you must distinguish between military and non-military targets. The second, under that category, is proportionality. I mentioned to you that if a small PT boat from Iran fired a missile at an American ship, Donald Trump would not nuke Iran. Why? Because Donald Trump and his leaders understand proportionality. Okay? Proportionality is that you must not use such disproportionate force as to commit a much greater harm than was committed against you. Okay? This is going back all the way to ancient law, and it's referenced obliquely by Jesus when he talks about an eye for an eye. Proportionality. Okay? The lex talionis, which is one of the oldest laws that we get from the ancient world. It's found also in the Mosaic Code in the Old Testament, says that you lose one eye if you take someone's one eye. You don't lose your life. Okay? You lose one eye. Proportionality is the idea that when you go to war, you must not absolutely destroy an opponent if they were not absolutely destroying you. And you can think through some of the implications of this, but the example I gave will be one of them. Our military attempts to be proportionate in its responses. It doesn't mean necessarily playing nice, okay? It doesn't mean that you invite them to tea, but it means that you cannot overreact. And if you overreact, even in the event that you had a just right to go to war, your carrying out of that war means it's not just. Okay? So when we look at wars, and we look at just war theory in particular, we've got two prongs. Do I have the right to go to war? If yes, go on. When I'm going to war, am I carrying out the war? Am I waging the war in a just way? When it comes to going to war, you look at two things in particular. Is it defensive? And do you have a reasonable plan of winning? And then when you're carrying it out, are you discriminating between military and non-military targets, and are you acting proportionate to the threat? How do you apply this to the Crusades? It's hard. Okay? There's an argument that the Crusades were waged defensively. Some of the stories of atrocities that were coming out of the East over to the West are true, and that's still debated by scholars. Then there'd be an argument that they were waged defensively. Was there a reasonable plan of success for success? Well, probably. Once you've taken the city of Jerusalem and you've taken the surrounding areas, you've succeeded in at least one of your goals. some of the stories that come to us from the Crusaders are just really horrifying. I've read enough of these to not know whether to laugh or weep, but one of the stories that I remember comes from the Siege of Antioch. And I always tell this to my high school classes, and I tell them, they're always mixed classes, boys and girls, and I always say to the girls, this is what happens when men are in charge of things, okay? But what happened was the Crusaders built a ton of ladders to scale the walls, and they built them about 2 feet too short. So all of them got to the walls, put the ladders up, and were walking up the ladders when they realized they couldn't get over the wall with them. Okay? I always say that as an example of this is when you put men in charge, at least men like me, this is what you get. Okay? So they were probably, if you believe the accounts of atrocities, waged with some defensive purpose. Okay? There seems to have been some defensive purpose behind them. In terms of the plan for success, it seems like there was. Okay? What about the conduct of the Crusades? Well, there were so many Crusades, it's hard to say. Which crusade are we talking about? On the whole, very much consistent with what you would have found throughout the rest of the world at this time, there were tremendous atrocities committed against civilians. Okay? And not just civilians, but often Jewish communities in Europe were threatened and often killed or tortured by crusaders. Okay? With the rationale being, we're going to kill infidels in the Holy Land, but we have some of them here anyway, let's get those while we're on our way. Okay? So many of the Crusades resulted in tremendous atrocities against Jews in particular in Europe. One of the stains on Christian history, actually. In terms of proportionality, the Crusaders were very similarly matched to the Muslim armies. It was very much a back and forth for a number of years during the Crusades. So the Crusaders won some of the battles and lost some of the battles. It was not as if the Crusaders had such superior resources or manpower or anything like that as to be able to be always successful, to the point of being disproportionate. What do you all think? Do you think the Crusades, given what we talked about with just war theory, do you think that the Crusades were just?
Got to go back to who owns Jerusalem.
Yeah, who owned it, that's true.
The one thing that stands out is that the Muslims and Islam have taken over so much. And I don't think they were conquered until the Ottoman Empire. When was it? I mean, they weren't even conquered in the Crusades, were they? And then,
Well, yeah, I mean, there are different Muslim regimes, essentially. The Ottoman Empire is one of them, but then there are a number of others. The
but in the
Abbasid,
Crusades, they were never conquered, right?
not entirely, no.
So,
No. Yeah, what about the rest of you? Was it a just war? Again, I mean, one of the hard things about answering it is there were so many wars, right? It kind of depends which one you're talking about. One of the things, and I opened with that story from the trenches in World War I for a reason. One of the things that's really scary about glorifying war is it often leads you into places you never expected. All the folks at the beginning of World War I who were talking about let's just have a little bloodletting and everybody will feel better, had no idea that millions and millions and millions of lives, a whole generation in Europe would just be wiped out over these disputes. And when you have leaders who don't care about that, that's really scary. The Prime Minister of Great Britain was named H.H. Asquith. Great old British name, right? H.H. Asquith. And while the war was being fought and hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were dying in the mud in the trenches, he made sure not to break his routine of vacationing at his country resort every weekend. And he made sure not to allow a telephone to be put into his country resort because he didn't want to be disturbed. One of the stories that comes down to us is of his housekeeper asking him, Mr. Asquith, do you take any interest in the present war? Okay? He's the prime minister, right? Key battles were lost because they couldn't get a hold of the prime minister at his country resort, okay? That's not good. That's not good. You want people in charge who understand the horrors of war, how bad that actually looks like on the ground. And, when you tell people, especially young people, that war is glorious and we'll go, kick their butt and we'll teach them a lesson. When they get out there and they're seeing their friends being blown to pieces, it doesn't look like what they were told, and that's a very disillusioning kind of event. So I think we need to be a lot more sober about it. The Crusades are a great example of one of those things that went terribly wrong. at points. I mentioned to you that a Christian capital got sacked at one point. Constantinople in 1204 was brutally sacked by Christian armies. Okay? A Christian capital attacked and destroyed by Christian armies. Those kind of things happen when you go to war. So you've got to be very, very careful before you do that you have a good sense of where this is going to go.
Yeah, and another really evil thing about it is that the Pope started selling indulgences, and this is the church. There was only one church back then.
You're making an interesting point that the Pope was very much using his spiritual powers to induce people to go on crusade. Okay? And that's a really scary thing. If you've murdered a man, you've committed what Roman Catholics would call a mortal sin, right? But if you go on crusade and go kill Muslims, you can be absolved of that. You can be forgiven of that. That's really scary. You also don't get your best and brightest going on a crusade when you incentivize that, right? If you're a murderer, go on crusade and you'll be forgiven. Well, murderers are going to go murder more people, right? So that's a very scary development. The Reformation that we'll talk about next week and the Reformers are very, very keen to talk about the dangers of the Pope wielding the sword. The Pope having this kind of temporal power to raise armies and go on crusade is really, really scary. Other thoughts? Yeah, sure.
It seems like we didn't have the Crusades. It would be the same as it is today, practically. Almost like it didn't make a difference, except to keep the population down.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sent a lot of troublesome forces in Europe into the Middle East, and that had very mixed results. You're taking usually the second-born son, as I was saying, who's off fighting wars against fellow Christians, and just transplanting him over there. That's not a great idea, although it may work in the short term. There's a great deal of resentment that exists to this day over the Crusades. Campus Crusade for Christ recently changed its name, right? Because it realized that having crusade in your title isn't a great idea if you're trying to evangelize someone who's a Muslim. It doesn't bring up great memories for them. We live in an age of serious conflict between Christianity and Islam, and it's important to actually know what Islam believes. One of my favorite crusading texts is the Song of Roland. There's a little Penguin edition of it. It's a beautiful little text about a group of medieval knights fighting in Charlemagne's army around the year 800. And it's written over a period of hundreds of years, and as it gets rewritten, Charlemagne gets taller and taller and older, and by the end of it, the final telling, he's 200 years old and has this long white hair and is this brilliant king and general. But one of the things that you get a sense for if you read that is how little these crusaders knew about Islam. For one thing, they thought that Islam worshipped 3 gods. Okay? Now, Islam is quite wrong on the question of the Trinity, but it's wrong in completely the opposite way. Right? Islam is so monotheistic and so extremely monotheistic as to consider Christians to be tritheists. Right? Your Muslim neighbor thinks that we worship 3 gods, right? Which is not true. And we've talked about that when we talked about the Trinity. We worship 1 God in 3 persons. But it's important to know what you're fighting. And one of the things that we learned reading about the Crusades is that most of the people going on crusade didn't really know what they were going on crusade about. They were there for treasure, for glory, those sorts of things, and that's very dangerous. Read the Song of Roland sometime if you're looking for a really fun read. There's a Penguin edition that's translated by Dorothy Sayers, and it's really wonderful, really beautiful. But you'll get a sense that most of these guys had no clue what they were fighting. Yep.
What occurs to me is that we really don't know a lot about the Crusades. Learned today that we expended 1,000 long period of time.
Yeah.
It also occurs to me that our general knowledge of the Crusades is tilted towards negativity towards Christians.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Barack Obama mentioned the atrocities of the Crusades.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like it's a blot on the Christian reputation in general for people who don't really know much about it.
It very much is, yep. And there are a couple different possible responses to the bad press that Christians get for the Crusades. And I think it depends who you're talking to. One thing I would not do is get in an argument with somebody about casualty numbers. When the Crusaders took Jerusalem, were there 80,000 people that were slaughtered or were there 5,000? Well, I think as a Christian you should say Christians should not be capturing cities and killing women and children. full stop, no matter how many there were in the city. At the same time, it's important to put this in context. And if you're talking to somebody who has an interest in history, it's important to know that 1,000 years ago, the rules of war were very different. And there were atrocities that were committed on both sides. One of the most famous of the Muslim leaders was Saladin, or Saladin. You've heard of him because he fought against Richard the Lionheart in the Second Great Crusade. He's often depicted, and even was depicted at the time, as this very noble figure. He was quite brutal. He was quite brutal. Everybody was. So you can't just cherry pick events and say this proves that Christianity is a violent religion. That's not necessarily the case. I would have liked to have heard more voices at the time from leading Christians saying, let's not do this. I think sometimes we can get caught up in a rage or a fury and go along with something that's a really bad idea. And I wish there had been more voices standing up to Urban II when he called for the First Crusade. I think slow down and think about this a little bit more. We've got time for one or two more questions at this point. So, is there any, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I think I heard from a Jewish friend that because of the Crusades, the Jews don't like Christians.
Yeah.
Would that be right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, tremendous atrocities were committed across Europe against Jews by crusaders on their way to the Holy Land. Now, there are some notable exceptions to that. There were a few bishops in a couple of cities, especially German cities, who, at the risk of their own lives, sheltered Jews, very much like you would find then later in the Holocaust when a number of leaders did the same. Okay? But on the whole, it would not have been a good time to be Jewish in Europe. There were many of the myths that we still occasionally see being trotted out. It's terrifying, though, about Jewish people poisoning wells, eating children, those sorts of things. The kind of stuff that pops up now on really weird conspiracy websites. They were driving a lot of the animosity. Those kind of stories were driving a lot of the animosity against Jewish people in Europe. That's a tremendous stain on our history. That should have never been done. When Hitler launches the Holocaust against the Jews, he's got a long background of anti-Semitism to work with in Europe. And very sadly, even within some parts of the Christian tradition. Not Christianity at its best, but very warped aberrations from Christianity. Maybe, who wants to have the last question? One more question. You know you want to, Joe. No, I'm just kidding. All right.
I want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. This was a lot of fun. Next week we are talking about the Protestant Reformation. I'm really excited to talk about that. Some of what we've done has laid the groundwork for some of the Reformers' claims. When the Reformers say, you're not the only true church, there's already been a schism. Well, now we have a background for that, having talked about the Great Schism. When the Reformers say the Pope should not be wielding the sword, and when he does, bad things happen, now you get a sense for why that would be the case. So thank you all again for being here, and drive safely. I think it's still raining pretty hard, so be careful out there. Drive safely, and see you next week.